Hi, I'm John Kiriakou, and welcome back to Deep Focus. Donald Trump promised the American people during the 2024 presidential campaign that he would end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. Those were his words. I don't think anybody really believed that he would end the war in 24 hours, but the conventional wisdom was that Trump would simply end U.S. military support for Ukraine, force the Ukrainians to concede to Russian demands, and just declare victory. Some of what has happened since Trump won a second term has gone according to script. With the support of his Republican Party, for example, Trump has, for the most part, zeroed out military aid to Ukraine. Kinda, sorta. He invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the White House, where he and Vice President J.D. Vance humiliated him in front of much of the world's media. And most recently, Trump had a 2-hour-long phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. In the end, though, Trump has accomplished almost nothing. The conventional wisdom, as I said, was that Trump would force Zelensky to give up Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as Crimea. Ukraine would not be permitted to join NATO, but would be fast-tracked into the European Union. So what went wrong? We're going to talk about this with one of the world's leading experts on these issues. Dr. Peter Kuznick is a professor of history at American University right here in Washington, D.C., and the founder and director of the award-winning Nuclear Studies Institute. He's the author of many books, including The Untold History of the United States, which, along with writer, director, and producer Oliver Stone, he turned into a 10-part Showtime series. He's also a lifelong activist in support of peace and human rights. Peter, thanks so much for joining us. Always delighted to have you here.
And I always enjoy being with you, John.
Thank you. I know you can shed light on these issues that are so perplexing. So let's begin with what is probably the most basic question. Why hasn't this war ended yet? What is it that Vladimir Putin wants that Donald Trump isn't able to force Volodymyr Zelensky to give him?
Well, it's interesting in that Trump and Hegseth and others in the administration have said that they are willing to give Putin a lot of what he wants. They've said that they're going to veto Ukrainian entry into NATO. They said that Crimea is going to be recognized as part of Russia. They said that they're willing to accept a ceasefire along the current battle lines, which gives Russia most of, maybe 80% of, the land in the 4 oblasts that they've claimed. So that's pretty much giving in to a lot of the major issues. They are not supporting the demilitarization of Ukraine in the way that Putin would like to see. They're not supporting the denazification of Ukraine that Putin has demanded. But they are giving Russia much of what it wants. So then the question is, what will Zelensky be willing to accept at this point? And so far, Zelensky says that giving into those terms is to wave the white flag, it's to surrender, it's to capitulate. It would be humiliating. It would also very likely topple him from power. And his position right now is fairly strong within Ukraine. If there were elections, he would have a good chance of winning. There might be one or two other people who would be able to challenge him. Putin has also said that Zelensky is an illegitimate leader at this point, since they declared martial law and postponed the election. Zelensky's term officially ran out in 2024. He won't be the first leader to declare martial law and put off elections. I mean, that's happened around the world many times. So there's a lot of differences. The driving reality is that Russia is making gains on the battlefield, and that there's almost no chance that Ukraine can reverse that. One of the big myths in this war is that if we keep pouring enough arms and financial aid into Ukraine, that Ukraine will be able to drive Russia out of the four oblasts that it's controlling at this point largely. And that's not, there's no truth to that. Ukraine is outmanned, outgunned, out-strategized effectively. So the longer it goes on, the weaker position that Ukraine's going to be in. But there are people who are egging Zelensky on. And those are the European leaders. Some of the European leaders are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. They're not willing to put their own troops in, but they're willing to send money. They're willing to send arms, and they're willing to encourage Zelensky to keep on fighting. I don't think that's in the interest of the Ukrainian people. I don't think Ukraine's going to be in a better position a month or 6 months or a year from now than they are today. I think they're in a worse position. But Zelensky is surrounded by a lot of rabid nationalists, and his own self-interest might dictate remaining in the war. So the question then is, what can make this change that you and I can talk about?
Trump seems to be frustrated, Peter, that Putin isn't playing along with Trump's own plan. It's a little bit funny to me. It would be funny if it weren't so serious, but Trump seems to be surprised by this. Is it even within Donald Trump's power to force an end to this war, or are we in a situation now where really it's Vladimir Putin calling the shots?
Well, clearly, Putin has got much more leverage than Trump does or Zelensky does at this point. Uh, Trump can sweeten the offer in a way that can possibly entice Putin to being willing to negotiate an end to this war. Putin has said for a long time that he did want to talk to Ukrainians, and now he's said that he's willing to talk with and meet with Zelensky at some point. What the Ukrainians wanted, what Zelensky wanted, was to sit down in Istanbul with with Putin, and that was never going to happen. Trump said that if they did, he'd be willing to come and help the talks along. Well, that wasn't going to happen. But the usual process, and this idea that you can't negotiate because a war's going on, is crazy. We always negotiate during wars. We negotiated throughout the Vietnam War. We negotiated throughout the Korean War. I mean, that's what happens. And then you come up with a framework, and then you hammer out the details, and then the leaders meet and they sign off as the much more traditional approach. That seems to be what Putin is willing to do in this case. But there was an interesting article by Anatol Lievin that you might have seen in yesterday's Nation magazine. And Lievin lays out what I've been hearing from my sources also, that the Russian leadership is very divided, just as is the American leadership, and that Putin has his hawks and his moderates. And I got the same sense when I was just in Russia within this past month. And I got the same sense from Oliver Stone, who spent 40 minutes with Putin when Oliver and Ray McGovern and others were in Moscow recently. And Oliver met with all the heads of state who were there, and he met with the other Russian leaders. And the sense that I'm getting from all this discussion is that Putin is surrounded by hardliners, Russian nationalists, hawks who don't want to compromise, who want to see Russia effectively force Ukraine's capitulation militarily, who want to see Russia, if not take much of Ukraine, at least eliminate the current leadership there. And Putin has been actually a much more moderating influence in this. And so he's being pulled by two factions. Anatol Lieberman laid it out better than anybody I've seen recently. He's got a more moderate faction who wants to reintegrate into the West, and who wants to have the sanctions removed, wants to restore ties with the United States, wants to restore ties with the Europeans, uh, and is concerned about Russia being swallowed up, in a sense, by China, becoming too dependent upon China. There's another faction, a more hawkish faction, who wants to wash their hands of the West, says the West cannot be trusted. The West's modus vivendi has been to destroy Russia, to weaken Russia. And this has gone on for a century, more than a century already. And that the West is implacable in that regard and is not changeable. And that Russia should recognize that, defeat Ukraine militarily, and move toward the East independence and the third world, the global South. So there's a fight going on inside Russia, which we sometimes like to view Russia as a monolith. That Putin's the dictator. Putin calls all the shots, and he can't be trusted. Well, there's a
Right.
lot of people in Russia who think the West can't be trusted. And also, there's a recognition that Donald Trump can't be trusted, that Donald Trump flip flops all the time. One day he makes nice to Putin, the next day he threatens Russia and says we're going to increase the lethal aid and the funding for Ukraine. Trump is very, very, and Trump's own people are divided. You've got the Marco Rubios, who are traditional hawks and Russia and China haters. And you got the Tulsi Gabbards, who at least over the years have staked out a more reasonable position on this. You've got Lavrov saying every time he hears America first, it reminds him of Deutschland über alles. So you've got, people on both sides who recognize how dangerous the world is. But there are also many of us who understand that if this goes on, the risks of World War III and the risks of nuclear war are real, and that this has to be ended, and both sides have to compromise somewhat. Putin will have to say he's not going to demand the 20% or so of, the Donbass and Zaporizhia and Kherson that he's claiming. And I think that would be a concession. And then, because what you need is, the Chinese like to talk about win-win. You win, we win. It's in both of our interests. And that's the only kind of diplomacy that leads to a long-term peaceful resolution of a crisis. If Russia humiliates Ukraine, and Ukraine is forced to capitulate because Russia is in a much stronger military position and Ukraine simply runs out of troops. If that happens, the peace will not be stable. It will not endure. What you'll see is civil war there. You'll see guerrilla warfare. That is not what Russia wants or needs. And so, people have got to, but, the danger is that Trump's position has always been not win-win, but we win and you lose. With Trump's absurd trade wars and tariff policies, it went from we win and you lose to we lose and you lose. It goes to lose, lose, lose. That's what's so stupid about that policy, but it's stupid about a lot of Trump's policies. And as a diplomat, diplomacy takes patience. It takes nurturing. You have to build this up. And we've never seen any indication that Trump has got the patience or the wisdom or the vision to do that. It was interesting if you saw David Sanger's piece in today's New York Times saying now Trump is ready to walk away from the whole thing. He wants to wash his hands of the whole thing and say, this is your problem, you solve it. If that happens, that's not a good thing. And it's not even good for Russia. What we're seeing now is a so-called coalition of the willing. So you've got Macron, you've got Starmer, you've got Merz, you've got Tusk, you've got Callas, and they want to see Ukraine keep on fighting. even though they know can't win, even though they know that Ukrainians are going to die by the boatloads, uh, the Ukraine will only be in a weaker position. They think the longer that this goes on, the weaker Russia's going to be. And they've got this view, and this is what's so stupid about it. One of the other myths is that if Putin wins in Ukraine, his appetites will be insatiable, and he's going to gobble up one piece of Europe after another. We have to stop him there so we don't have to fight him here. It's like the American idiots used to say about
The
Vietnam.
domino theory.
Stop them over there so we don't have to fight them in San
That's
Francisco.
right. Ridiculous.
So you've got these domino theories, and you've got that stupid idea. And part of the problem, it was interesting to me, this kind of metaphoric thinking. When Robert McNamara and Paul Warnke came into my class several years ago, when they were both still alive, of course, and they talked about the lessons of Vietnam. And they both thought that by thinking metaphorically and drawing historical analogies, we confused our understanding. They said the dominant metaphor was the Munich analogy, the idea that uh, only strength prevails, and that if you appease a strongman or an autocrat or a dictator or whatever you want to call it, a communist in those days, uh, they draw the analogy of what happened in Munich and think that that has to be applied everywhere, that you've got to stand up to every form of aggression. And that's not always the case. And they said that that's what they were saying inside the White House and the Pentagon during Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh and General Giap were not Hitler and his henchmen. And it's a very, very different situation, and they applied the wrong understanding. And we're doing the same thing. We have statesmen, and Donald Trump is a man who knows no history and has no interest and doesn't read and is so shallow that everybody thinks they can just manipulate him because they know about his narcissism and his egotism and how he wants people to, assuage that pathetic ego of his. And so they think they can manipulate him. He thinks he can bully everybody and make deals. That is the world's greatest deal maker, this transactional presidency. And he's got no firm values. And so he'll flip flop, and he does flip flop on all of this, but his instincts are actually half good. I think of him as a fascist who wants to impose his own version of fascism worldwide, but he doesn't want to do it militarily. For some reason, he's got a long-term aversion to warfare and using force militarily beyond the minimum. And so during his first term in office, we almost went to nuclear war with North Korea, but we didn't. He'd rather write love letters, and I think that he wants to find a different way to impose fascism. We saw that spectacle in the Oval Office yesterday with Ramaphosa from South Africa, where Trump's now the spokesperson for aggrieved white farmers who are facing genocide. Idiocy, lies, completely made up. But is that Trump's, you know, game plan is so typically Trumpian that we roll our eyes, but it's very dangerous. And that's why I'm saying what he seems to want to do, along with Elon Musk and some of his other tech fascist buddies, is to impose fascism peacefully. So they want to support the AfD. They want to support the right-wing forces in Greece. They want to support these neo-Nazis around the planet. Um, so when I see Putin talking about the neo-Nazis who run Ukraine, it's just an exaggeration. Is there a neo-Nazi element in Ukraine that goes back to Bandera, who I hate, who are loathsome? Yes, there are a lot of them there. Are they gaining more traction? Yes. Are they defacing World War II's monuments and statues and plaques and other things? Yes. that's going on there. But there are also neo-Nazis in Israel. There are neo-Nazis in the United States. There are neo-Nazis everywhere. And to say that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis, is the kind of dangerous exaggeration that makes it harder and harder. Once you label somebody like Putin a dictator, a Hitler, or you label Zelensky and his people dictators and Hitlers, you can't talk. Once you do that, then diplomacy is off the table. And we saw that during the Biden years. And Biden was in some ways more dangerous when it came to Russia than Trump is, because Biden gave them one weapon system after another that he initially says, I'm not going to give that because it's too provocative and could lead to World War III and nuclear war. And who knows what's going on in Biden's mind, if anything. But he caved in, he collapsed over and over again. 2-3 months later, he gave them every weapon system, and then he gives them the attack and missiles and gives them authorization to strike deep inside of Russia. And, and what does Putin do? He launches his Oreshnik missile inside Ukraine, this new generation of missiles, nuclear capable, which H.R. McMaster, the former national security advisor, says we're not going to have the capability to shoot down these Oreshnik missiles for at least 15 more years. So Trump's got his wet dream, his golden dome, latest idiocy we could talk about. But, the Oreshnik missile would penetrate all of that easily. And then what does Putin do? He changes the nuclear doctrine and lowers it to say that any country attacking Russia with the support of a nuclear country, a nuclear armed country, then both of them are legitimate targets for any weapons that Russia might think necessary to defend itself. Again, we lowering the threshold for nuclear war. And I don't support that by Russia. I don't support it by the United States. But, if you don't mind going on this topic, what's going on globally is we're pushing closer and closer to the nuclear abyss.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next. Actually, you and I had this conversation a couple of months ago,
And
and
it's work today.
Yes, and you concluded, and I agreed with you, that we are closer now to nuclear war than we have been in many, many years. Do you believe we're still on that path? That we haven't created any off ramps, any diplomatic openings to try to change the course?
I think we're a little bit better.
A little
So
bit better.
I was saying, I was recently at a conference with John Mecklin, the editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I asked him, why did the experts, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, only move the hands of the doomsday clock 1 second closer to midnight? So a year ago, January, it was 90 seconds to midnight. Now it's 89 seconds to midnight. And John's answer was, well, we talked about moving to 88 seconds, but that's the international symbol for Heil Hitler. So we
Oh
didn't
my
do it.
heavens!
And so then I said, well, why don't you move it to 80 seconds or 60 seconds? Which is what I would have done. And uh, and John said, well, there were people on the board who wanted to move it to 80 seconds or 60 seconds, but there were others who resisted it. And I was recently on in a panel with one of the experts, so-called experts, who I'm sure was one of those who said, keep it at 90 seconds. His idea was so unrealistic. So I would say we've moved a little bit away from nuclear war when it comes to Ukraine, which is a good thing. That Trump's instincts on this are better than Biden's.
Mhm.
And that Trump said that we need to dramatically reduce our nuclear arsenals. He said the US, Russia, and China need to do so, dramatically reduce our nuclear arsenals, because he said we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 times or 100 times over. Well, his numbers are a little off as usual, but we certainly do have enough to destroy the world and possibly end life on the planet. And we look what's going on. I look at the picture globally and it terrifies me. we've got Macron doubling down day after day, along with Starmer, saying that the French are offering a nuclear umbrella to Europe, saying the American nuclear umbrella can't be trusted anymore. So France wants to provide a nuclear umbrella. And Merz in Germany, who was a real piece of work and a disaster, I think, horrible, uh, even worse than the Baerbock
Yeah,
Scholz
weak
regime.
and very right wing.
So right wing and so militaristic. I want to send their tourists. Everything uh, that could be done bad, Merz wants to do. But so they're welcoming the French nuclear umbrella. The Poland is welcoming nuclear weapons. Zelensky said that Ukraine should have its own nuclear weapons, that they made a big mistake giving up their nuclear weapons. Um, but it's not so the Europeans are going the opposite wrong direction. At the same time, that the latest I saw was that Britain is increasing its nuclear weapons by 40%. And so there's buildup going on everywhere. All nine nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, making them more lethal, more efficient, more deadly. And most of them have already committed to expanding the nuclear arsenals. But it's not just there. You um, look at South Korea. 73% of South Koreans in the polls say they want South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. Taiwan is talking about nuclear weapons. The Israelis, CNN just reported that Israel has drawn out concrete plans to attack Iran's nuclear fortification, nuclear base. So it was about Fordow, we're talking about Iraq, we're talking about other installations. And we don't think that Israel has the capability because they're very deeply buried and they're hardened. And the crazy thing, this is Trump 1, pulling us out of the Iran nuclear deal. Under the JCPOA, Iran had shipped out 97% of its enriched uranium, had mothballed most of its centrifuges, was enriching uranium up to 3.67%, which is what you would use for nuclear reactors, and was allowing very intrusive IAEA inspections, surprise inspections everywhere. So, and everybody kept saying Iran was not cheating. And so, what does Trump do? He pulls he abrogates the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and applies harsh pressure on Iran. And now he's trying to negotiate again. Iran now is enriching up to 60%. To get from 3.67 to 60% is the hard thing. To go from 60% to 90%, which you need for nuclear weapons, is not difficult. Iran could probably do that in a month or less. So they could fabricate nuclear weapons. Uh, but if Israel attacks, okay, it'll set back Iran's nuclear program. But then all bets are off. Then Iran, which the CIA says abandoned its nuclear weapons program back in 2003, then I'm sure Iran will rush for a nuclear weapon. If Iran develops nuclear weapons, who's next? Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Okay. Then we've got nuclear anarchy in the region. Ishiba in Japan, before he took office, said that Japan should have its own nuclear weapons. Japan, which has traditionally been the most anti-nuclear country in the world. Trump, in his first term, when he was told that the U.S. had dramatically decreased the size of its nuclear arsenal, Trump's response was, "Well, we should increase it tenfold." That's when Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State Tillerson, called him a moron.
Yeah,
So,
that's
but
right.
so we don't know which direction Trump will actually go. China, it looks like, as said, China used to believe a limited arsenal of 200 nuclear weapons was a sufficient deterrent. Now they're up to about 500. According to the Pentagon, Xi Jinping wants to have 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. So he wants to join Trump and Putin in being able to end life on the planet. And you've got all these reports. Look at Project 2025, which is Trump's Bible, They call for dramatically increasing the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and also to make a lot of smaller weapons that could be more easily used, smaller nuclear weapons. So we're going both directions, bigger and more, and smaller also to make them more used. So I'm saying that there's insanity. If we look at what the policymakers, I go back to two articles from August 20th. One was in the New York Times, and it's a David Sanger article. And Sanger said that the U.S. is preparing to fight a nuclear war simultaneously against Russia, China, and North Korea. There was an article the same day in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist saying that there are many American policymakers who think we could actually win a nuclear war. And we've had that fantasy for years. Back in 2006, there was a big report from the Council of Foreign Relations by Lieber and Press, in which they said the United States has now achieved a first strike nuclear capability, that if we struck first against Russia and China, neither would be able to respond to the United States. That nuclear first strike capability we've been wanting for decades, we've now achieved. Heads exploded in Russia, in the Kremlin, and in Beijing. And what did they do? They geared up their nuclear programs to be able to resist it. Minimally a second strike, but also first strike capabilities. So what we're seeing around the world now is people have forgotten how horrific nuclear weapons are, which is why I love Annie Jacobson's recent book, Nuclear War. Because Annie lays out, how much time the U.S. president would have to respond to a report of an incoming missile attack on the United States? 6 minutes. While they're getting all this information, all these people pushing them to go up the escalatory ladder, they have 6 minutes to respond. And to make a decision that's irreversible. Unlike what Reagan said, once those missiles are launched, you can't, pull them back or change the flight path, and the world is over in 6 minutes. And in many ways, Annie shows how it's over in 72 seconds. Everybody needs to read this. When Oliver spent his 20 hours with Putin a few years ago, he asked Putin if he'd ever watched the movie Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
And Putin said no, he hadn't. So Oliver pulled out his computer, and he and Putin sat together and watched Dr. Strangelove. And in many ways, the Strangelove scenario, in which you have a General Jack the Ripper who's obsessed because after having sex, he loses energy, and he thinks that a normal physiological reaction is because of a Soviet plot to use fluoridation to destroy and sap our vital fluids, launches a nuclear attack again. Okay, so it's a black comedy, represents a degree of craziness that we haven't seen. However, another movie came out in 1964, 6 months later, based upon the same book, Red Alert by Peter George, that had been written back in 1958. And because of a plagiarism suit, the movie Failsafe came out 6 months later. And when Oliver and Ray McGovern were there, I urged them to show Putin Failsafe this time, because it's a more realistic scenario. It's about a technological glitch that leads to the launch of America's nuclear weapons against Moscow. Now, Henry Fonda plays the president there. He says if he had seen the Peter Sellers performance as the president, Merkin Muffley, in Strangelove, he could have never played it straight. But he did, and it's a brilliant movie also, and very powerful. But based upon a more realistic scenario, because we've had that happen several times, that you get false reports of an incoming missile strike. It's happened to us.
Oh,
and
yes.
It's happened to the Russians.
Yes, it has.
And fortunately, we had human beings there in the chain who were able to stop it, who doubted that it was accurate, and who did not do what they were supposed to do, which was to give the order to launch. Or to send it up the chain to others who would give that order. We were lucky. We've been lucky to survive as a species over and over again. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 27th, which Schlesinger said was not only the most dangerous day in the Cold War, it was the most dangerous day in human history. Aboard that Soviet sub that was accompanying their ships that the U.S. was dropping depth charges and hand grenades on, they gave the commander gave the order to launch their nuclear torpedo. And, if Arkhipov, another commander on board, had not talked the first commander down, then we would have had nuclear war then. And so it's too dangerous. What we need to do, which is why Trump's idea of a golden dome is so wrongheaded. And Russia and China have said it's only going to accelerate the arms race and make the world more dangerous. But it's a $500 billion boondoggle to Elon Musk and the other tech billionaires. And so if you're saying that what we need is everybody needs a defensive system so that they can shoot down each other's missiles, I think a better idea might be to get rid of those missiles, to get rid of those nuclear weapons. So before we end up blowing ourselves off the face of the earth, which could happen. It's real.
It could. It actually could. I wanted to ask you too, if you see anything positive, if you see any return to collegial relations between the United States and Russia, is there any hope for a lifting of sanctions in the near or medium term? Is there anything that we should be looking forward to? Or are we in kind of a state of diplomatic chaos right now?
We are in a state of diplomatic chaos, but with Trump, that could flip on
Yeah.
a dime.
Yeah, it could.
Trump has said, and even in his phone call with Putin 3 days ago, so everybody was expecting that if Putin did not agree to immediate ceasefire and negotiations along Trump's lines, that Trump would impose new sanctions or he'd give new arms to Zelensky. Trump's response was, basically a plague on both your houses. We're going to wash our hands of this. And he said but he also said a couple of things. One is he said most Americans don't know this, but I do, that the Russians lost a lot more men in World War II and the Russians fought heroically. That's a better statement about World War II than Trump's previous one, in which he said that the United States deserves all the credit.
Yeah, we won it single-handedly. Yes.
Yeah. Which younger people believe.
Sure.
They have no understanding. I might have said it before on your show, but I did a survey with college students, all of whom were A students in high school history, and I asked them how many Americans died in World War II. The median answer I got was 90,000, so they're only 300,000 off, slightly in the ballpark. I asked how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000, which means they're only 27 million off, which means they have no idea what World War II was about, what the Cold War was about, what the Ukraine war is about. And so we're dealing with ignorance. Zhou Enlai once said, that's the charming thing about Americans. They have absolutely no historical memory. But it was Santayana, who's better known for this statement about American philosopher, who's better known for the statement that those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. But he also said, a nation without historical memory is a nation of madmen. So to get back to your point, Trump is potentially a madman. He's easily provoked. He's got, a short fuse, and and his reactions, knee-jerk reactions, are impulsive in that regard. So he could take us to the brink or beyond, but he could also do the opposite. And he said that he wants to end this, wants the word end, so he can lift the sanctions and have and expand trade. He said there's enormous trade opportunities to develop Russia's energy and its rare earth minerals, and Russia's got tremendous potential, which is true, of course. And so I could see Trump going either direction. Yeah, I was just in Moscow. They invited me to chair the documentary jury at the Moscow International Film Festival. And I did a dozen interviews. I gave a talk at Moscow State University, after which the dean told me that I was the first American to have spoken at Moscow State University in more than 3 years. Can you
Wow.
imagine that? You know,
It's just incredible.
and so in my talk at the film festival on national TV, when I made the award presentation, I had this talk about the Chinese film that won, but I decided to make some impromptu remarks first. And I mentioned, that how sad it was that there were only myself and John Robinson, a really good actor, were the only Americans at the film festival. And I told about Moscow State, the fact I was the first American to speak there in 3 years. And I said it reminded me of what John Kennedy said at his American University commencement address in '63. How sad it was to think of the gulf between the Americans and the Russians. And I said, I feel that way today, and that Russia has to end the invasion of Ukraine so that we can get back to having the kind of friendly, collegial, collaborative relations, peaceful relations between our two countries that the world needs and that we need and should have again. And I got a lot of applause, even though I called it an invasion and said it needed to end. But everybody I spoke to in Russia, maybe it was more in the film community, but also the media and members of the Duma I spoke to and policymakers, everybody was either opposed to the war on principle because they don't like war, or they were weary, exhausted by the war, and ready for it to end. So Putin has got to speak to those people and address those concerns and ignore the hardliners. And we've got to find some, force it. What the Europeans are doing is the worst thing that they could possibly do to the Ukrainian people. And it's also the worst thing they could do to the world right now. Instead of prolonging this in the so-called interests of Ukrainian people, we've got to find a path toward peace immediately, toward diplomacy. During the Biden years, diplomacy became a four-letter word, right? It was not mentioned. And all the strategic talks, security talks with Russia and the arms control talks were off the table, and we couldn't deal with that madman dictator Putin. Well,
Let me interrupt you on that point too. I equated the Biden foreign policy with the George W. Bush foreign policy for the
yeah,
same reasons that you just raised. Talk to no one, conduct diplomacy with no one, impose sanctions on everyone,
yes.
and make sure Congress does as it's told.
And also
Which
give a home to the neocons. I mean, one of the
exactly,
bizarre things is that the
exactly right.
neocons who dominated the Project for New American Century folks who took over all the positions in the top positions in the George W. Bush administration, now they've
Yes,
become Democrats. And the Democrats
yes,
are more
and
of a
they're right at
party of
home.
warmongers than the Republicans.
That's right. They're right at home. Peter, where can people I listen, you're an eminent professor at an important university in an important program, but there has to be a path to you for the average American who's curious about these issues to find. Where can people go to see more of your work? Where can they go to find out more about you?
Well, the good news, I got a call from Oliver a couple days ago, and we talked about doing a new edition of the Untold
Oh,
History book.
oh, wonderful, wonderful.
So, he even brought up the possibility, if we get the financing, of doing one or two more documentaries, which I would love
Great.
to do in addition to the book. The book is out in way more than 20 languages. Somebody just contacted me from Iran the other day and said they found it in the library in Farsi, which I didn't even know
Wow.
was the case. Um,
Fantastic.
so, what I do at this point, aside from writing and a lot of articles mostly, but I did 360 TV and some print interviews around the world last year. So they can find me pretty much everywhere at this point. Um, but I also did a couple dozen talks around the world. I'm visiting a lot of countries again. So I do a lot remotely, but like you, I'm often on tour and not quite as elaborate as your latest exciting speaking tours. Um, but uh, you know, I so and Oliver, Oliver's in the game. In fact, as you
Yeah, thank
probably know,
goodness.
Oliver and I did the Tucker Carlson show together recently.
Yes,
A- and Tucker,
I watched every minute of it.
and it was great. Tucker really is very concerned about the nuclear threat and very concerned about the neocons and their influence in the Trump administration and their warmongering.
In fact,
So
I'm going to go on the Tucker Carlson show on June 2nd, and we're going to talk about exactly the same issue. The
good. I'm
the
so
the
glad to hear that.
neocons are not shy about forcing their way right back onto the stage, whether they're wanted or not.
No,
Yeah, we
that-
have to stop them.
I'm glad you're going on there.
Me too.
I mean, I'd love to go back on again,
Mhm.
and um, that's fabulous.
Thank
Some of
you.
the best news I've heard in a while. Good. That's just such an important
It's,
audience,
it is.
and the reason I went on there, it didn't even enter my mind, but I have a student who I love, former student who's a Trump insider, and I asked him, "What's the best way?" We're having lunch. I asked him, "What's the best way to influence Trump's foreign policy?" I figured he set up an appointment meeting with somebody or other. And he said, no, go on the Tucker Carlson show. Said that's what Trump. And then when Oliver and I were on there, Trump reposted it on his Truth Social
Oh
platform.
my God. Yes.
So,
See, that's
and,
having an impact.
and our friend Jeff Sachs had been on that morning. Oliver and I were on the same day in the afternoon. So if you
Fantastic.
and Jeff and Oliver and I can get to reach those people, they've become the anti-war people in the country now.
That's right.
Uh, and so we need to talk sense about other things too.
We
But,
do.
you know, the immigration policies are insane. The trade war is insane. The cutting the programs for poor people so they can give tax cuts to billionaires.
Right.
Who thinks in those ways?
And has the guts to
We're
say it
already in
out
a
loud.
planet, John, we're already in a planet where the richest 6 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion, and it's going the wrong direction. You can't live in a planet that's that crazy.
No.
Global warming, just everything that's going on is so unfortunate now. But I'm so glad you're getting out there and speaking and
Thank you.
reaching those
And the
audiences.
same to you. You are the voice of reason. Your voice is respected, and I'm glad that you're out there speaking out as much as you are.
Thanks, John. We've got to do everything
Thank
we
you.
can because we're in a dire situation.
We are indeed. Peter Kuznick, thanks for joining me again. Peter is a professor of history at American University. He's the founder and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute there and the author of a whole bunch of books, including that Untold History of the United States. And I'd like to see it on Showtime again. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, John. Take care.
Take care.